Okay, welcome back to the Cycling Science podcast. It's been a while since we published an episode, and the reason for that is I've been rather busy, distracted, completing my new book, the Routledge Handbook of Cycling Science, which is now submitted, due for release in October, and I'll share details of that once we're closer to publication. But today we're back and I have a brilliant guest to kick things off again. Joining me is John Wakefield, performance coach and head scouting at the Red Bull BORA Hansgrohe rookie program and independent coach at Science to Sport. John and his colleagues published a paper back in 2022, the compound score, which changed the way many people think about talent identification and professional cycling. And over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to dig into John's views on how you actually find, select, and develop riders who go on to succeed at the highest level. So welcome, John. Great to have you in the podcast. And maybe you can kick us off and just give us a little bit more about your background and yourself, and maybe how you got into cycling in the first place. Did you race as a young person, a young rider, or did you come into the sport from a different direction?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. Just a little bit of background is I definitely didn't come from a cycling background. I fell into it a little bit by accident due to an injury. And the injury cycling essentially was part of my rehab. I broke a back, I broke a leg pretty badly, and obviously you are relatively limited in terms of your kind of rehabilitation processes and that, and I can't really swim unless it's doggy paddle. So a bicycle was given to me by the gentleman over the many years of my rehab, who was an ex-professional cyclist, and as things happen, the bug bit, and I raced just super local stuff. I would probably call it at best Cat 1. But it was good. For me, I really enjoyed it. From how I fell into, more on the performance side, is my background essentially was motocross and training, coaching, etc. And through that, I'd met who's now my business partner and head of performance at UAE Team Emirates, Jeroen Swart, and he had said to me one day out of the blue was, why don't you try do some cycling coaching? This was back, I think 2008, somewhere around there. And I landed up where I am today. So it was really by accident. Just on your kind of introduction, my role has sort of changed this year at Red Bull BORA hansgrohe, from the director of development, and that from last year I've moved now just across to director of coaching, sports science and technical development, but I still work relatively closely with the new director, and I did work super close with him last year, Tim Mason, who has now taken that position. So I sort of, to be honest, fell into cycling and coaching in this position a little bit by accident, about 15 odd or whatever years ago. So it's been great. Can't complain, to be honest.
Great. But obviously, as we said in the introduction, and you alluded to it there, obviously you're kind of very much in terms of the development side of the team and looking for the next generation.
Yes.
So, what kind of drew you specifically to that side of things, the talent identification? Because obviously coaching is quite often it's a mix of, you're working more with established athletes, if you like, but the program at Red Bull BORA hansgrohe is quite an extensive program, isn't it? So you can start at a reasonably young age.
It starts kind of with that under 17, under 19 identification. We have the Granco Auto Ida team, which is under 19 based. And then we have under 23, and obviously we have World Tour. How I sort of got into it was going back to my early days around the motocross. With regards to that coaching, I had a professional team that I managed for a good couple of years. And from there, you're sort of identifying them, depending on what class it is, but you're already looking at kids that are sort of 10, 11 years old. You can turn professional at 16 at motocross. So that young hunt, if you want to call it that, was really young. And that's kind of how I kind of got into the development side. And I was kind of, I would say, lucky or honored enough to work with some riders that I've worked for 20 years, so from that side, and it was really longevity where they were 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, and, all the way through to their professional careers that, some of them stopped at 30. So, from that side, and you get all the processes through that, whether it's, development from an athletic ability or trying to teach some kid that heartbreak is fine because his girlfriend broke up with him at 14 years old, that life goes on, and that's all part of the development side. And also dealing kind of with parents and stuff like that are very zealous at the same time. So, yeah, I would say it comes back down to my motocross years, and I really enjoy it from that side.
And of course, I unfortunately I've been in the cycle coaching side of things for a very long time, and I think over 35 years now. And but when I think back, when I was a young kid looking at the professional cycling scene, the profile of the peloton was quite a lot different than it is now. It was, there wasn't many very young riders, for example, that were dominating. The Grand Tours, for example, and we look at the current crop, and they keep coming with the new generation. So the whole thing has changed significantly. I presume then that obviously puts more pressure on the established Pro Tour teams to have that pipeline, because it's a race, isn't it, to find the next Podgar or Vinegar, so that you need to find the next generation.
Yeah, it's definitely become how do you say, an arms race for the younger generation. And a lot of what I feel in general is that, everyone's scared to miss out, which is it's a normal selection process and a feeling, if you want to call it that, where what I use the word quite a lot, but modern cycling, which I would probably say is from 2019, 2020 now, to modern times. And it's kind of grown, from your age of your peloton, where, the years you were talking about, you would send maybe a 20, 23-year-old to a Grand Tour for 2 weeks for him to experience what's going on. Now you're sending a 20-year-old to win a Grand Tour, and also how the racing has changed, how training has had to accompany that. I said to someone the other day, what I was doing 10 years ago, I wouldn't have a job today if it was coaching aspect, so everything is revolutionized. It's higher, faster, stronger, and that's where it is. And I feel a lot of it comes from, because the peloton is getting younger, and you look at junior racing, even back in the day, it's just go, 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 go. It's just full gas, 100%, and guy who went faster finishes. And that's the only way they know how to race. So now that comes into the World Tour, so it's that, and then you have that evolution of how the peloton is changing, and they say, oh, there's no respect for the older guys. I get that to a point, but it's not that, there's that wave is growing. So you're getting more younger guys who are coming, well, this is how I raced last year, so this is how I'm going to race this year. And that's where that evolution comes. And then, you add in all the technologies, if you want to call it that, whether it's, every kid is a power meter now. They all have the latest, greatest bikes. They all have, everything, everything that's available at World Tour, essentially you can almost buy now, so you now having that aspect. And then obviously the professional side of it is, and I kind of blame a little bit, even before Tadej, I would go back to even Egan Bernal. I think he started this wave of young guys when he won the Tour, and really phenomenal phenom of a rider, and then it was like, these young kids are be able to do that. And that's kind of where it grew. And then, I remember my first year or second year in UAE, which was 2018, 2019. It was a huge volume of young kids, and 10 out of 10 to them at the time. You were like, wow, this is a big amount. You know, they still need to learn to race a bike, but they did that, and that's kind of where that influx came from. Then other teams, and not to say that UAE were the leader in that, there were young riders on other teams, but that's where that influx came. I would say 2019, 2020, when there was that big focus.
Yeah, no, I think it's quite if you reflect, we have riders now saying that they're going to retire at an age where previously would be expected to be winning your first Tour de France.
Yeah, correct.
So that's kind of like nearly a generational change.
Yeah,
Um,
because I think, there you also question is, if we say how intense the peloton is now and how hard the racing is what we don't know yet, I think, is how long those careers are going to be. Like, is it a 8-year career because it's just so intense for such a short period of time? Or are you going, you know, the original 15-year career for some people? I personally can't see that at this level of where it is. I think that stress load is just too high, personally. So do you go an 8 to 10-year career, or is it a 5-year career if someone doesn't make it? But even if you go 8-year career, that theoretically, that rider's still under 30 when he
yeah,
finishes his career.
yeah,
I mean, at 28, I can tell you what I was doing, but I definitely wasn't ready to retire. So it's and then kind of going deep into it, but then there's other complications that I think is like, what are they going to do for the rest of their life? Are they adapted to the real world? And if they didn't have a successful career, means do they have financial stability? And I think a lot of unknowns at the moment outside of the racing, but the racing at the moment is fantastic.
yeah.
So
Yeah, I've done a few of I did the Grand Fondo, World Championships, when they were in Scotland, and in my
mm,
age group, you had Maximilian Lely, and you kind of
yes,
reflect that somebody who did, I think, 26 Grand Tours.
yes,
Are we going to have people in the future, people in current peloton that will do 26 Grand Tours? I'm not sure, because I think their careers will be shorter.
yeah, correct,
And as you say, the intensity, and I think there's the wider aspect of the, I suppose, psychological, financial, I don't know, in the public eye pressure as well. I think a
yeah,
lot of the current top riders, even struggle with that.
yeah, for
It's a
sure,
real challenge. So
yeah,
anyway, let's come back to talent identification, and I think one of the things that you talked about there is obviously is that now if you look at sort of younger age group racing, you have an awful lot of it's very hugely competitive, and I reflect on my time when I started with British Cycling to help with develop their coach education program. And I look at what that did in the UK in terms of sort of youth and junior racing. All of a sudden you had a whole lot of young kids that had been got the foundations, the basic techniques
mm,
nailed down, and then the quality of the racing was just immense. And that, I think, for me, that's your base of your pyramid. For ending up obviously with a development team, with a pro tour team. But in theory, you should be getting riders now that have an awful lot of the basic techniques nailed down, and that gives you something better to work with.
yeah. Yeah, in theory you should, but you still get guys that can't take a bottle from a car, but yet they're doing hypothetically 6 watts a kilo for 20 minutes at a young age,
Yeah,
but yet you give them a bottle and they're
yeah,
a little bit underneath the wheel,
yeah.
so,
No, and I think for me
so,
that was the
yeah,
thing about the coach education program. It
mm,
wasn't necessarily building the engine. The engine's important, but that can be developed later.
yeah,
I think as you highlight, you can have all the engine you want, but some basic stuff like you can't get food out your back pocket or take a bottle or
yeah,
cape on,
correct.
then ultimately you're going to be in trouble. Um,
Yeah,
and that's just the basics before you can corner fast. And we
yeah,
even in the pro peloton we can see plenty of people that can't descend very well, and it hurts.
yeah. or even just being able to surf the peloton from an economical value. If you're always just doing 40/20s all day, it's a tough day. Just trying to stay out of trouble.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to just sort of pivot a little bit now towards, obviously you were a co-author in this paper back in 2022 in the terms of the development of the compound score, and I know things, because obviously I've heard you talk at conference, and things have moved on probably since that original paper. But
Yes.
can you just talk us through, obviously what was the thought processes about that, and what were you trying to do with that type of approach
Sure.
in the development program?
Yeah, so if we go back a little bit, I think just to the compound score itself, that was something that was, it's been around, when I say been around, from Jeroen Swart, back to, I think, 2009, 2010 maybe. And we used it, obviously our company that at the time was very based only in South Africa, and we had used it sort of in South Africa as identification of a rider, as a more comprehensive view, so there we get, kind of like not just an absolute value, so rather, we kind of get a matching results value on stuff. And sorry, and we kind of kept it to ourselves all the time. And then when we kind of came more international and, got more involved with from the world tour level and that, we had sort of started implementing it a lot more kind of seriously, and also updating some of the values and identification points on it from data that we got. And, from that side, you get a much more overall comprehensive identification of what a rider is, as opposed to just one watts per kilo value. What we did with in that study was obviously based around under 23s. Peter Leo at the time was still very connected to Tyrol. He still is now, but he was working deep with inside it. And it was to kind of correlate where the compound score landed up in terms of results for a rider, and where that landed up on the scale. However, obviously, fresh everyone is good. So we had identified from a 2,000 kilojoule workload, where that kind of rating score came in terms of, did this value result in this value of results, or, were we under or over? And that's kind of essentially where it came from. Really good at the time, I will say. I'll say it plainly, I was like, man, we are really ahead of the curve with this. And unfortunately, last year, what myself and Dr. David de Klerk presented at Science and Cycling, we realized that the peloton is at under 23 and under 19 level has definitely moved on, especially from a durability side with how the racing is. However, I had used, when we created the under 23 team, so the rookie team for Red Bull BORA hansgrohe, I used the compound score and the durability compound score very much for composing and compromising that team in terms of riders. And then, as I said, the data that we sort of presented came out in terms of results to general population.
So, just could you just give us a little description of a basic outline of what the compound score is, just for our listeners and viewers? And
yes, so essentially it combines absolute and relative power. So what you do with it is you multiply a rider's 5-minute mean maximal power by their watts per kilo from the same effort. So if you take whatever 70 kilogram rider, his 5-minute power is 450 watts. So what's that? 6.4 watts a kilo. And then you multiply, and then you would multiply that, you would get a compound score essentially of like 2,000. What is it? 2,900 close, 2,890. So it would be essentially 450 multiplied by the 6.4. that was the original methodology. It still is. However, we had taken it a step further, because that's obviously it relies quite heavily on a weight perspective. So a lighter rider would have a lower value. So you needed to also understood where you were in a weight category. But what I had done then to get an overall value in today's cycling times and modern cycling is we created the mixed compound score, which was 3 different values, and that gave us an even more deeper overall value and score of a rider's ability.
And of course, you kind of half alluded to it there in terms of weight's really important, and if you're a lighter rider, you might get penalised a little bit with the compound score. Obviously, when you think of the composition of a pro team, there's quite a variety of different, and I'll use the term somatotypes, different types of riders. So you're going to have your out and out climbers. You're going to have your time trialists. You're going to have, and your time trialists can be doubled up as your big engines that sit at the front of the peloton and drive it along. Josh Tarling type, physique. So
sure,
how does that come into the decision making in terms of development and selection? Because you do need a profile. Because I think many people who don't understand professional cycling don't understand how much it's a team sport. And you need it's like having a goalie and a forward and a midfielder if using the football context.
Yeah, so that it is kind of vital or essential in terms of building a team. That was also very much the approach we took with our rookies. It wasn't just we wanted 10 GC guys because we'd never make it to the climbs or whatever the case may be. So that's a little bit also where why I created the mixed score. And that gave us a complete overall view of what we wanted. So we wanted, as you said, we wanted a sprinter, we wanted a GC guy, we wanted a helper, we wanted a time trialist, etc. And those benchmarks were kind of categorized, and that's how we had approached that. So, yeah, not alluding too deep into it, but that was how that makeup happened. So, just in terms of benchmarks of what we were looking for.
And obviously, the other aspect that I'm just going to move on to now is you have a human being, you have a person in front of you. There are other factors apart from what the engine is like.
Definitely.
So in terms of those factors, and because I know from my experience of people who I've been up close to who at youth level or junior level have won senior titles, etc., and so on. But then the wheels fall off literally because it's a stressful environment. And so there's a whole load of other things that go into making a successful professional cyclist. One, how do you assess those kind of within your development process or even selection into the development process? And then what do you have within the development process to try and help and support those elements that ensures that you think you've got a really good talent here, but you have to make sure that you have a whole and stable person that can undertake all the training that's required, can take the ups and the downs and so on. So how do you develop that?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and that is really, there's no definite clear protocol answer in that for it, because you have objective and you have subjective, and you need those two to kind of connect as best as possible. Data is one thing, and you can have a rider that has the best data and you think we're going to go win everything, and you just can't translate that onto the road. But you also have another side of that where you have a rider that maybe doesn't have the best data, but he's definitely racing over that ability in terms of physiology. in terms of identifying that, it comes down to, which that goes very much to our phenomenal scout Tim Nosen from a person, let's call it a personality side. We, during interview processes and kind of investigation into the athlete, we do quite a lot of homework in terms of the actual athlete, take away all the data on whether it's Training Peaks or whatever performance platform they have. And we do quite a deep dive into that. It's never perfect. If it was, I think I'd be sitting somewhere in my villa in, I don't know, in Switzerland or somewhere, a very rich man, if I could get that 100% perfect. But there's definitely a step-by-step process that we do within the team to definitely try identify that, in whether they, I would just say, I won't say psychologically, but just from a human element, where they are, where we see they can go. I always look at it as, how did they get there to where they are today? When we look at that rider, so we say Michael Smith, we get hold of the rider. I try understand where he is got to today, and where or what we could potentially get out of him going forward. And in what role that rider will be. Because what you got to remember really much from a young kid is that you can't really, at 17 years old or 18 years old, even say, oh, he's going to be a GC rider. It's, if someone's doing that, they're selling a story, is my personal opinion, which is not wrong. Yes, you have a good idea, and where you think he can go. But, we had one where we thought someone was a really good classics rider, but he's now becoming a GC rider. It's like complete chop and change. And it was really pleasant to identify that. So it's a hard job. As I said, we have systems and protocols and kind of investigation in place to try identify that as best as possible. And I think back in the day, if you want to call it, and I think when they looked at young kids, it was purely just, oh, he's doing X amount of numbers and, hey, we've got it, where that doesn't really translate always onto the road. I don't believe purely from a maturity side, is he a well-developed kid or is he not? I haven't felt that that's been a major asset into it, where other sports like maybe rugby and stuff like that, obviously it plays a huge role. Kid's 60 or 90 kilos and, you don't put him in the scrum, but I don't really see that as a massive identifier or a reasoning in terms of the young kids at the moment. It's more other factors of like load and processes and training ages and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think sometimes you can pick out people who have an unbelievable drive to succeed. I coached some youth riders quite a few years ago now, but it was the Youth Tour of Scotland, and Tom Piddock was riding, and that was when he was, a young youth rider, and you could tell straight away there's somebody who is unbelievably driven to succeed in cycling. Now, obviously, at that stage, it's really difficult to know.
Yes.
A 14-year-old going to be, what a top, an Olympic champion, a world champion, and so on. It's quite difficult to guess at that stage, but certainly that's some of the aspects you might want to have, is that they individually have a huge drive, and it's not just the parents.
Yeah, correct. And, yes, you need a supportive family or a supportive background and stuff like that. But you do now, I feel kind of, we call it the modern peloton, especially in the younger categories prior to World Tour, there is a really strong drive, whether it comes from the parents and it get passed to a manager, because every kid now has a manager. I mean, like you speak to a 15-year-old kid, he's like, oh, I speak to my manager. I'm like, you're 15 years old, mate. It's like, so there is that pathway that's being pushed. And, you always say, managers and their best interest is in the rider. But some of the stuff you hear, it's like, this kid's 16, you can't give him a 7-year contract, because you don't know where he's going tomorrow, and where you want him to go, naturally, and you want to develop him and that. But, sometimes I just, and you see how that goes, and then the kids unfortunately get lost in the system, and they definitely don't fulfill their potential.
So I've got a couple of questions in mind here in terms of, from your experience, what's been the most common human factor that you've come across that's inhibited, the progression and ultimate selection of the young cyclists that you have come across?
Wanting too much too soon. That's it. It's and it's not, when I say a patient pathway, I don't mean years and years. I just mean like the correct pathway and stuff where, kids will go, well, I'm coming out of under 19, so now I go straight world tour at 18 years old or 19 years old. And, it takes a very, very special kid for that to happen, like really an outlier. And I just feel that there's steps that are missed because they just want something too soon, or they are, if we really go maybe on the negative side, they just too arrogant to believe that they are that good, unfortunately, or they're just impatient, and they want it now. And that, I think, is probably the biggest inhibitor, and they get lost in the system, as I said, and they definitely don't fulfill their potential, and whatever that potential is, nobody really knows, but that to me is probably the biggest hurdle that they have and setback.
So do you think that some of that's around, like, because, no matter how good you are, you can't win everything. So is it a bit around resilience and understanding the fact that, there is a path, there is a progression, and it's not a linear one?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I also think around that is sort of the education and the support of the athlete, in terms of, if we just use a parent, them actually understanding the process, and not selling your kid. If it's a rough term, but, just in lines with that, and understanding the system and not going, well, just because he won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 races in under 17 or under 19 is now, and because he pushes close to a good world tour number, which they all do, to be honest, that they're now going to be successful at world tour. It's a very different kettle of fish once you step into those ranks, and you also have a very short, I would say, life to kind of deliver on your promise, because if you don't deliver in 2-3 years, there's some other kid that will deliver, and unfortunately teams and scouts and that will identify that and put a focus on that.
And what sort of activities and things do you provide, the young cyclists in the program to try and help with that? Because, I could imagine, you see a young cyclist who has potential, but there's some aspect of this human factors that we're trying to cover here that's not under. So what sort of things and programs do you provide to help them there?
Without saying what I shouldn't, we have let's call it an off bike, if we call it that. So not like on bike stuff. I believe that we have, from our under 19 and under 23 teams, we have a very good off bike education system, supporting system. We educate them on a lot of stuff. One being as simple as how to send an invoice in. Where some really don't know how to do that. Something as easy as that. And just
there's a lot of life skills there.
Yeah, life skills, if you want to call it that. And as I said, I feel we really have a very good off bike education system within our structure, that we do support the riders with on a very regular basis. Is it perfect? Probably not. Nothing is perfect in cycling, but our supportive education system is very good.
Okay. I'm just going to move on, and sort of topic in terms of, because I think it ties into this, in terms of the support. We've explored, it's the complete package. It's not just the engine. The person has to be focused and guided in the right way. But of course, you said earlier about it's the timing is critical. That you've probably only got a relatively small window of opportunity to progress, and if you don't, then there's always somebody else coming up behind. So there's always going to be a whole load of people who don't make it. And what's what's the potential reasons generally that you find that people don't get selected? Is there the most common reason that people don't get selected?
Yeah, I won't say there's one common reason. It could be many things. It could be something, unfortunately, from not fitting into a team, being difficult, or kind of just a solo agent, if you want to call it that. Let's call it a personality. I think maybe that's the correct wording. Off bike, that really does contribute to a team environment, especially one that we like to create. And then the other side to that is, it's as simple as that, just non-performance on the bike. That's obviously one of the probably the most common one, and not fulfilling I won't say an expectation, but delivering on a job, on the expected job or their prospective performance environment. I would probably put it down to those two being subjective and objective. You can be a really phenomenal bike rider, but if you are, teammates don't like you, you're rude to staff, etc., that it's not really an environment we like to encourage within the team.
And just obviously, the number of people that get discarded is always, by the very nature of the system, is greater than the number of people who progress. It is a pyramid, yes, and the pyramid's getting very narrow at the top.
Yeah.
Do you provide any support and help for those people who don't make it?
Not particularly as a long-term thing. But going back one step is, if you take, them making it in that. So essentially, we want to have riders from under 19, under 23 into our World Tour team. There's obviously only so many places you can fill, for whatever reason, available contracts, positions, what we want, climber, sprinter, etc. However, just if a rider doesn't go World Tour with us, but yet they've come through the system and we've developed them and they've gone to a Quick Step or they've gone to a Tudor or whatever, different team, and been successful, we've still done our job as a development program. It's just little, I would say, kind of, you're a product of the environment, but again, they're showing that our system works. Perfect example was Leonard Yash. We took a chance on him, great guy, everything. However, the time didn't work for us to go further with him. It wasn't, we didn't want him anymore. Just the environment didn't work, or it wasn't, the opportunity wasn't available. But yet he's gone to Tudor. He won a stage the other day and he's doing really well. So, for us, we feel, okay, great. We still done our job as a development team, overall. If they don't go from us to another team, or they don't kind of go through the system with us for whatever reason, I don't think any team in the world at the moment, and I'm happy to be corrected, has a continuous program for them, in terms of, like, let's call it integration back into the world or whatever the case may be. I don't know anyone that does that. I actually don't know any team that does it either. I don't think football does it. I don't think, any major sport does it. But I may be incorrect in saying that.
No, because you could see where, within, you talked about the education program that you've got, where some of that could be, how do you cope with failure?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty harsh word, failure, because it's not really failure.
Non-success. We can use that to it.
A lack of success.
Yeah.
At this point in time and so on. But I think that, I think you can help and support people.
Yeah. But they're like, within our system and our processes, is that, should a a rider not have success at this race or that race or whatever he's going through an injury period, our education system does support that fully. You know, it's like, you know, if you say, oh, do you offer ongoing support? You know, in 5 or 10 years, you're going to probably have 150 riders on your plate, you know, as a system. It's a lot of phone calls in a day.
So, I think I was really thinking much more about the more immediate support, you know, because probably that's the most stressful point in time in terms of, you know, if you mentioned the riders who are hugely driven and ultimately they might not make it.
Yeah, sure.
How do they cope psychologically with that? I think mostly psychologically, and is, you know, and I suppose it's trying to tell them actually it's not a failure. It's just that at this point in time you haven't succeeded at this, but doesn't mean to say there are not other options for you.
Yeah, correct.
And obviously, we talked a little bit earlier about how the, if you like, standards at the sub pro tour level have all improved and increased. So maybe the transition from, you know, under 19s to under 23s or whatever up to the, you know, is not as steep as it was. But there's some riders will struggle for that. Do you have any specific, if you like, preparation for that, or do you feel that that's just built into the development program that you've already got?
Yeah, it's not that. It is built in, but more from kind of a subconscious development process. It's not like we have A, B, C, D in place for that. You know, that is a natural progression as they go through the ranks, etc. You know, so it's not like we, as I said, have a protocol or something like that specifically for it. It's kind of more of a natural progression, and we support that progression in different ways. But that gap, as I said, it's not really that big anymore. You know, under 19 to under 23, I will say it is a bigger step from under 23 to World Tour. Yes, it's a big step because of the depth, but it's not a totally new environment. Because also you got to remember that a lot of the development teams that are connected to World Tour teams, some of the riders are already going, when I say racing with the World Tour team, yes, not World Tour level races, but they're doing races with the World Tour team, you know, whether it's 1 or 2 guys or a Sibiu tour or something like that, you know, so that sort of process is definitely happening.
And some of them are winning.
Yeah, 100%, you know, and that's across all the teams, you know, so it's not that one team is special and they're doing it. You see it all the time.
John, obviously you've highlighted, you know, you've been involved with this process for quite some time, and you know, you're quite, you know, thinking of the compound score. You know, obviously you're looking for evidence-based approaches about how you know, select and develop the young riders. But there are a lot of myths out there. Is there anything out there that you feel in terms of, you know, junior selection or development that just really are myths and should be squashed? Anything you've come across you think, nah, that just doesn't work?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think early specialization is one of them, especially for the young kids. One that I am a strong believer on is that, you know, as a primary selector, VO2 max is not it anymore. You know, I know before it was, oh, this guy's a VO2 max of 90 and they sign him. I definitely don't believe that that's a primary selector anymore, as a myth. And then I think maybe, you know, confusing maturation timing with talent is kind of a fair target on that. You know, I kind of had said that earlier, is that I don't fully believe that maturation timing is fully connected with cycling at the moment.
No, good. I think those are 2 really good points, and I certainly would agree with those 2. In terms of then, you know, because, you know, this podcast, I always like to give some sort of practical takeaway, you know, particularly for coaches. You know, we get quite a few coaches who watch this podcast. Um, what would your takeaway be for sort of working with talented, juniors and youth riders? Obviously, who wouldn't have access to the resources that you would have, but what could they do in terms of helping them to, because ultimately they'll come to selection as well if they're looking at junior teams and so on. So,
Yeah.
is there any snippets that you might say, look at this?
The first thing I would say is really just be patient with them. I really am a strong believer in that. A lot of, especially if we've done interviews and stuff and a coach is involved, I get the feeling sometimes it's very much like, I'm the coach, so I've done this and I will push this. Where I feel it's a selfish environment. It's not really for the athlete, and the outcome is the athlete. If the athlete is successful, you tag along with it. That's kind of how it works. It's not, well, I'm the guy, and if it wasn't for me, this is it, and you push it. That I feel is I maybe ego is a bit of a strong word. I don't think it's that, but that sort of environment I really feel is important, especially in the young kids. Young kids are very impressionable at the same time. So I think as a practical takeaway is remember what you tell a kid, they believe it or they think it and that. And, if you're telling a kid the whole time you're going to be the next Tade or the next Remco Florian and that, they develop into that view, um, so I think from that side, yeah, being gentle with them, I think, and supportive as opposed to pushing, I think is really important for coaches. I think without a world tour infrastructure, if we want to use that, or a development infrastructure, and then from I think, yeah, I would probably say those two are probably the most important things from that side of it. And then you can obviously get whether profiling races, whether the format suits the rider, etc. Whether, you know, yeah, like you don't have to always have a kid in a lab, which is what we see a lot of the time. And just be consistent with tracking and relative versus absolute tracking over time. I think that's really important as well.
And I suppose the other thing that I see a lot of is not just for sort of junior riders and but also for older riders is this concept that they all want to copy the Pro Tour riders and do exactly what they want to do.
Yeah, correct.
So I guess you would agree and say, well, a youth rider shouldn't be trying to cycle 20,000 miles a year.
No, definitely not, because that is where you do get a physiological ceiling, and the kid just won't progress after a certain time. There's an example. We sometimes do see kids, young kids, like really young kids, that are doing 20, 25-hour weeks, and they've done it for relatively consecutive seasons. And there will be stagnation. You hit kind of like an early peak, and you may be phenomenal now in your category because you have that growth, you have the load, you have all that development from a physiological point. But that's typically where it is, and you can't get much more out of that kid. And that's often very unfortunate. But the problem is, I feel in today's time is you have access to so much information. It's like what you can see on the net is exactly what I see on the net. It's just what you do with that information, and and that's where the key comes in. And someone asked me the other day is, what do you guys do special in terms of apps or software and stuff like that? I think the general public has more access to stuff than what we use, to be honest with you. Whether it's basics of Training Peaks to everything that to an Aura ring. And I just feel with that available, there's just so much information available, and you get lost in translation, but then you're using everything that's available to you, and you get this, what do we want to call it? I would say like a robot of sorts at a very young age. They lose that personal feeling of what it is. Hey, does 400 watts feel like on your legs? And they can't tell you, because they're not reading it on the screen, or, I feel bad today because my heart rate variability says X, or your sleep score. And you say, yeah, but how do you feel? No, I feel fine. And you're like, well, then you go ride your bike. So I think a little bit in that side, it's dangerous in terms of what you have available to what you can make sense of and use. And yes, stuff like that is important. But as I said, in today's times, everything is available.
It's death by numbers.
Yeah, it is.
So, we kind of touch on there on the fact of, there is a lot of technology out there. AI, for example, is
that's also true.
all, where everybody's going to be AI'd at some point.
Yeah.
Where do you see, this type of talent identification and development going in the next 5 years? What's on the horizon? Do you see anything that's happening?
I think, which we said earlier, you can never guarantee that, Michael Smith will win the Grand Tour in 2035. It's, as I said, it's a story if you're selling that. But I do believe you can make, or you will be able to make better or informed decisions quicker, based on where it's going, and get a much more, I'll say, a better grip or a better view on the athlete. But I definitely don't see it, well, at least when I'm alive still, being you plug it into a machine and there's your answer and it's perfect. And it doesn't matter what you put in, whether it's power files, it's medical data, whatever. I don't see that, but I do see it being more precise or more fine-tuned and quicker decision making, with the help of, let's call it AI, from that side. But you also got to remember, AI only tells you what you teach it, so it also comes down to that, so it really comes down to me and you giving it information of what we want. And yes, sure, it can be quicker and you can maybe identify 3 guys in the space of what you used to be able to do 1 in the time frame. So it helps from that sifting side, if we want to call it that. But I definitely don't feel that human side is gone. Even, what, as I mentioned his name before, Tim Mason, who's now the director of the rookie development project as a scout. And, I've never seen someone do it from a human element of what he sees and kind of has that feel in a rider. I don't think yet that personal thing can be replaced by a computer, if we call it that, yet.
And I think fundamentally, you probably agree with me, it's still an awful lot about getting the basics right.
Yeah,
correct. Rather than going for all these shiny new apps or, whatever software, I think an awful lot is about getting the basics right.
Yeah. Like there, as an example, when I moved into the position I'm in now, we literally went back to some basics on a lot of stuff. And then you can go forward, and you can then add in all the shiny apps and that, as you said. But if you don't have the basics, you don't have a foundation. And then you're lost in translation on stuff.
Fantastic. John, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I think you've given us genuinely a sort of a different way of thinking about how talent is identified and developed in professional cycling. Really appreciate you sharing your experience and your work with us. And obviously, I need to thank everybody for watching or listening. I hope you've found it as interesting as I did. Talent identification is one of those topics that sounds straightforward until you start digging into it. And I think John has shown us just how much depth there is there. A couple of things before we go. First, the podcast is going to be a lot more regular from here. One of the reasons to say it's been quiet is the fact that I've been finishing the new book, The Routledge Handbook of Cycling Science, due to be released in October. And my plan is to work through by interviewing all of the contributing authors. So actually that's 43 chapters. So that's potentially 43 episodes. So there'll be no shortage of material coming your way. And second, if you're not already across it, we've recently revamped our website at cycling-science.com, and you'll find the podcast episodes there, the previous ones, and we've also launched a more extensive blog that we will be weekly. So the idea is to take some of the most recent research, cut through the complexity, put a practical spin on it, so it's actually useful to you as a coach or an athlete. So thanks again for watching or listening. We'll catch up with you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.